Catwoman of West London, The True Story of Minnie Pheby, the Lady Burglar. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. In the winter of 1896, a young woman in a brown jacket with puffed sleeves and a pair of stolen boots was caught red-handed in a kitchen in Shepherd's Bush. Her name was Minnie Pheby. She was 20 years old, agile, clever, and entirely unexpected. In the annals of Victorian crime, the figure of the burglar looms large, usually male, often violent, and always a threat to the sanctity of the English home. But Minnie Pheby didn't fit the mold. She was a woman, and a young one at that. She didn't just break into homes. She slipped through windows barely wide enough for a child, scaled walls with the grace of a cat, and vanished into the foggy London streets before the police could blink. She lived in the shadows, not as a victim or a bystander, but as a protagonist in her own right. This book is not a work of fiction. It is a true account of a woman who defied the expectations of her time and carved out a place for herself in the criminal underworld of Victorian London. Minnie Pheby was not a household name, at least, not for long. Her story was splashed across the newspapers for a few brief years, then faded into obscurity. But in those years, she challenged the very notion of what a woman could be. She was not a lady in distress. She was the one climbing through the window. I first came across Minnie's name while researching female offenders in the Old Bailey archives. Her case stood out, not just for its rarity, but for its audacity. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how little we know about women like her. Women who didn't conform. Women who weren't content to stay in their place. Women who, like Minnie, chose the night. This manuscript is the result of digging through court records, newspaper clippings, police memoirs, and social histories. Where the historical record is silent, I have drawn on the broader context of the time to fill in the gaps, not with speculation, but with the lived realities of women in Minnie's world. The narrative is told in a silent third-person voice, allowing Minnie's actions, and the society that judged her, to speak for themselves. This is not a tale of redemption, nor is it a cautionary fable. It is simply the story of Minnie Pheby, cat burglar, criminal, and woman of her time. Introduction: A woman in the shadows. In the final years of Queen Victoria's reign, as gaslight flickered across the soot-streaked streets of West London, a young woman moved through the city with quiet precision. She was not a suffragette, nor a servant, nor a seamstress. She was a burglar. Her name was Minnie Pheby. She was 20 years old when she first appeared in the dock at the Old Bailey, charged with breaking into 2 homes in a single night. She had entered through a window no wider than a man's forearm, stolen jewelry and household goods, and fled across garden walls in the dark. When the police caught her, she was dressed in a brown jacket with puffed sleeves and a pair of neat boots, both stolen. She was, as the press would later marvel, a new thing in burglary. This manuscript is the story of Minnie Pheby's life and crimes. It is a story drawn from court records, newspaper reports, police files, and the scattered traces of a woman who defied the expectations of her time. It is not a tale of redemption, nor is it a cautionary fable. It is a reconstruction of a life lived in defiance of the roles assigned to women in Victorian England. Minnie Pheby was not the only woman to steal in the shadows of empire, but she was among the few to do so with such daring and independence. She did not act as an accomplice. She did not plead coercion. She did not apologize. She climbed through windows alone. Her story unfolds in a city on the brink of modernity, a city of gas lamps and gallows, of workhouses and wax museums, of moral panic and tabloid sensation. It is a city that feared crime and yet could not look away from it. A city that recoiled from the idea of a woman burglar, even as it devoured every detail of her exploits. This is not a work of fiction. Every chapter is grounded in the historical record, however incomplete or contradictory. Where the facts fall silent, the narrative turns to the world around her, the laws, the prisons, the press, and the people who shaped her life. The result is a portrait not only of a single woman, but of a society caught between repression and fascination, order and disorder, light and shadow. Minnie Pheby walked those shadows with her head held high. This is her story. Chapter 1: A Proper Young Lady. In the year 1876, amid the soot-streaked skyline of Victorian London, a girl named Minnie Pheby was born. The city was a place of contradictions: gaslit grandeur and grinding poverty, horse-drawn carriages rattling past barefoot children, and the clatter of industry echoing through narrow alleyways. It was a city on the cusp of modernity, and Minnie arrived in its midst, unnoticed by the world she would one day scandalize. Little is known of Minnie's earliest years. The official records are sparse, and the newspapers that would later obsess over her exploits had no reason to take note of her birth. But the fragments that remain, court transcripts, police reports, and the occasional line in a yellowing broadsheet, offer glimpses of a life shaped by the city's margins. Minnie likely grew up in the working-class districts of West London, perhaps in the crowded terraces of Shepherd's Bush or the soot-darkened streets of Hammersmith. These were not the slums of the East End, but they were far from genteel. Families lived cheek by jowl in cramped lodgings, eking out a living through domestic service, factory work, or petty trade. The Pheby name appears in scattered census records, often linked to laborers, seamstresses, and washerwomen, people who worked hard and died young. By the time Minnie was born, the Elementary Education Act of 1870 had made schooling compulsory for children up to the age of 10. It is likely she attended a local board school, where she would have learned to read, write, and recite the catechism. The curriculum was rigid, the discipline harsh, and the expectations clear: girls were to be obedient, industrious, and modest. Education was not a path to opportunity, but a preparation for service. If Minnie's early life followed the pattern of her peers, she would have left school in her early teens to enter the workforce. Domestic service was the most common occupation for girls of her class, and it is here that we first catch a glimpse of her. In later court proceedings, her employers described her as quiet and hardworking, a model servant it would seem, with no hint of the daring that lay beneath her demure exterior. But London was a city of masks. Behind the lace curtains and polished brass knockers of the West End, secrets festered. The same streets where Minnie delivered laundry or fetched groceries by day became her hunting grounds by night. The homes she cleaned, the routines she observed, the locks she oiled and the windows she opened, all became part of a mental map, a blueprint for the life she would soon choose. There is no record of Minnie's parents, no mention of siblings save for a cryptic reference in a later indictment to two women, Sarah and Emma Pheby, from whom she allegedly stole a brooch and a few shillings. Were they sisters? Cousins? Perhaps even her mother and aunt? The court did not ask, and Minnie did not say. She was not one to explain herself. What is clear is that by the age of 20, Minnie Pheby had already begun to slip through the cracks. Whether driven by poverty, boredom, or something darker, she turned away from the narrow path laid out for girls like her. She did not marry, did not settle, did not stay in her place. Instead, she climbed. She climbed through windows and over walls, into parlors and pantries, into the pages of the Illustrated Police News and the dock of the Old Bailey. She climbed out of obscurity and into infamy, becoming what the press would call a new thing in burglary. But before the headlines and the handcuffs, there was just Minnie, another girl in a city full of them, walking the cobbled streets with her head down and her eyes open, watching, waiting, learning. A proper young lady, or so they thought. Chapter 2: Shadows of Victorian London. The London of Minnie Pheby's youth was a city of smoke and soot, of gaslight and grime. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost in the same breath, where the clatter of carriage wheels echoed through cobbled lanes, and where the poor lived cheek by jowl with the rich, separated only by a few streets and an unbridgeable gulf of class. By the 1880s and 1890s, the city had become the beating heart of an empire that stretched across the globe. Ships arrived daily at the docks, their bellies full of tea, spices, cotton, and opium. The wealth of colonies flowed into the capital, fueling a building boom that transformed the skyline with grand terraces, railway arches, and the first flickers of electric light. But beneath the surface, London was a city in crisis. The Industrial Revolution had drawn thousands from the countryside into the capital, chasing work in factories, docks, and workshops. The result was a population explosion that outpaced infrastructure. Tenements rose in every direction, crammed with families who shared water taps, privies, and beds. Disease was rife. So was desperation. In the East End, the slums of Whitechapel and Spitalfields became synonymous with squalor. But the West, too, had its shadows. In Shepherd's Bush and Hammersmith, where Minnie would later ply her trade, the contrast was stark. On one side of the street, a row of tidy villas with lace curtains and polished knockers. On the other, rows of lodging houses and back-to-backs, where the smell of coal smoke and boiled cabbage clung to the air. It was in these liminal spaces, between wealth and want, respectability and ruin, that London's criminal underworld thrived. The city's thieves, fences, and fraudsters were not confined to the alleys of the East End. They moved through the city like smoke, invisible until they struck. Burglary, in particular, held a peculiar place in the Victorian imagination. It was a crime that struck at the very heart of the middle-class ideal, the sanctity of the home. The Larceny Act of 1861 defined burglary as a nighttime offence, committed between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m., involving unlawful entry into a dwelling with intent to steal. It was a crime of stealth and audacity, requiring physical prowess and a certain theatrical flair. The press reveled in tales of burglars who scaled drainpipes, picked locks with skeleton keys, and vanished into the night with silver candlesticks and heirloom brooches. The most notorious among them, men like Charles Peace, were immortalized in penny dreadfuls, wax museums, and stage plays. They were villains, yes, but also folk heroes of a sort, clever, daring, and unrepentant. Women, however, were rarely cast in such roles. The Victorian ideal of femininity was rooted in domesticity, piety, and submission. A woman might steal out of desperation, shoplifting a loaf of bread or pawning a borrowed brooch, but to break into a home, to violate the private sphere of another woman's parlor or boudoir, was unthinkable. When it happened, the courts often assumed she had been led astray by a man. Yet the records tell a different story. Between 1860 and 1939, more than 1,000 women were tried for burglary in England and Wales. Most received lighter sentences than their male counterparts, a reflection not of leniency but of disbelief. The system could not quite accept that a woman might act alone, with intent and agency. Minnie Pheby would become one of the rare exceptions. She did not plead coercion. She did not blame a lover or a husband. She climbed through windows on her own, carried her own tools, and made her own plans. In doing so, she stepped out of the narrow confines of Victorian womanhood and into the shadows, where she would remain, unseen and underestimated, until the moment she struck. Chapter 3: First Forays. Before the headlines, before the courtroom sketches and the incredulous gasps of the press, there were the quiet nights. The ones that passed unnoticed. The ones that left no trace. Minnie Pheby's first steps into the world of burglary are not recorded in any official ledger. There is no surviving charge sheet, no witness statement, no breathless newspaper column describing her earliest crimes. But by the time she was caught in 1896, she was already an accomplished thief. That much is certain. She did not begin with grand houses or daring escapes. No one does. The skill she would later display, lockpicking, silent movement, the ability to vanish into the night, were not learned in a parlor or a prison cell. They were practiced, refined, and perfected in the shadows. London offered no shortage of opportunity. The city was a patchwork of vulnerabilities, unlocked scullery windows, inattentive housemaids, alleyways that twisted like veins through the urban sprawl. The homes of the middle class were filled with small portable luxuries, silver teaspoons, brooches, watches, and purses, easy to pocket, easier still to sell. It is likely that Minnie began with these. A coin from a dressing table. A necklace left on a washstand. A coat lifted from a hook in a hallway. Crimes of convenience, committed quickly and without fanfare. She may have posed as a maid, a washerwoman, a seamstress, roles she knew well. She may have knocked on doors under the pretense of delivering laundry or seeking work, slipping inside when backs were turned. The city's criminal economy was well-oiled. Fences operated out of pawnbrokers, second-hand shops, and market stalls. A stolen brooch could be sold within hours, its stones pried loose and reset, its gold melted down and recast. No questions asked. No names given. Minnie would have learned the rhythms of the street, the times when houses were empty, the routes the constables walked, the places to hide if things went wrong. She would have learned to move without drawing attention, to blend in with the city's army of working women. She would have learned, above all, to trust no one. There is a suggestion, buried in the records, that her first conviction may not have been in 1896. A newspaper article from 1900 refers to earlier sentences, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, for housebreaking. If true, these would place her first arrest in her late teens, perhaps as early as 1894. But the details are lost, or buried in the archives under misspelled names and fading ink. What is known is that by 1896, Minnie Pheby was no novice. When Detective Sergeant Knott found her in the kitchen of number 4, Askew Road, she did not panic. She did not plead or cry. She ran. She vaulted a garden wall with a bundle of stolen goods under her arm, landing in the arms of a waiting constable. It was not the reaction of a first-timer. Her methods were precise. She entered through a window just 8 inches wide. She wore a black cashmere dress and neat boots, both stolen earlier that evening. She had already burgled another house that night, slipping in and out without waking a soul. She was, as one journalist later wrote, a cat among the parlors. The press would marvel at her nerve. The courts would struggle to comprehend her. But Minnie Pheby had been preparing for this moment for years. The city had taught her well. Chapter 4, The Night of the Cat Burglar. It was a bitter February night in 1896 when Minnie Pheby made her move. The streets of Shepherd's Bush lay quiet beneath a low grey sky, the gas lamps casting long shadows across the cobbles. The city slept, unaware that a young woman in a brown jacket and black cashmere dress was slipping through its cracks. She had already struck once that evening. The home of Herbert Tyson had been her first target. There she had scaled a wall, found a narrow window left ajar, and wriggled through an opening no wider than a man's handspan. Inside, she moved with the confidence of someone who had done this before. She took what she could carry, jewelry, a clock, a pair of boots, and vanished into the night. But Minnie was not finished. A few streets away, number 4, Askew Road stood in darkness. The Hawkins family had retired early, as they always did. The scullery window, small and easily overlooked, had been left unlatched. It was all the invitation Minnie needed. She slipped inside without a sound. The house was still. She moved through the kitchen, her eyes adjusting to the gloom, her hands already reaching for anything of value. A brooch here. A purse there. She worked quickly, methodically, wrapping her haul in a cloth bundle. Outside, Detective Sergeant Henry Knott was on patrol. He had been watching the area for weeks, ever since a spate of burglaries had unsettled the neighborhood. Something about the crimes had struck him as odd. The entry points were too small for most men. The thefts were too clean, too quiet. He had begun to suspect that the culprit was not who, or what, everyone assumed. That night, as he passed Askew Road, a flicker of light caught his eye. A faint glow in the kitchen window of number 4. It was unusual. He paused, watched. The house should have been dark. He summoned 2 constables and positioned them at the front and rear of the property. Then he knocked on the door. Mrs. Hawkins answered, bleary-eyed and confused. Knott brushed past her, moving swiftly through the hallway. In the kitchen, he found her. Minnie Pheby stood frozen, her bundle of stolen goods in hand. She was dressed impeccably. Her boots, as it would later turn out, were among the items taken from the Tyson home earlier that night. For a moment, there was silence. Then she bolted. She ran through the back door, leapt the garden wall, and landed in the next yard. But the constables were waiting. She was caught, breathless and defiant, her loot still clutched in her arms. The arrest made headlines. The Illustrated Police News dubbed her a new thing in burglary. The press could not get enough of her. A woman burglar? Stylish, athletic, and unrepentant? It was too good a story to ignore. At the station, she gave her name, Minnie Pheby. She was 20 years old. No occupation. No fixed address. No husband. No excuses. The charge was burglary, 3 counts. The victims, Herbert Tyson, Annie Morris Hawkins, and another unnamed party. The evidence was overwhelming. She had been caught in the act, wearing the stolen goods. She made no attempt to deny it. At the Old Bailey, she pleaded guilty. The courtroom was packed. Reporters jostled for space. The judge, perhaps unsure how to sentence a woman for a crime so thoroughly coded as male, handed down a relatively light punishment, 9 months imprisonment for each count, to run consecutively. Minnie showed no emotion. She stood straight, her chin high, as the sentence was read. Then she was led away, the first chapter of her public life closed. But it was only the beginning. Chapter 5, A New Thing in Burglary. The Illustrated Police News wasted no time. On April 2, 1896, just weeks after Minnie Pheby's arrest, the paper ran a story under the headline, A New Thing in Burglary. The accompanying illustration showed a woman in a fashionable jacket and boots, caught mid-flight, her skirts billowing as she leapt a garden wall. It was sensational, lurid, and entirely in keeping with the paper's reputation. But for once, the story was true. Minnie Pheby had become a curiosity. A woman burglar was not just rare, it was, to many, unthinkable. The press, prim and breathless in equal measure, struggled to reconcile her femininity with the nature of her crimes. She was described as elegant, neat, stylish. Her black cashmere dress and puffed sleeves were noted with more attention than the items she had stolen. The fact that she had entered a house through a window barely 8 inches wide was treated as both a marvel and a scandal. The public lapped it up. In an age obsessed with crime and propriety, Minnie was a contradiction too delicious to ignore. She was not a victim, not a fallen woman, not a tragic figure led astray by a man. She was something else entirely, a woman who acted alone, who planned her crimes, who ran when cornered and asked no one for mercy. At the Old Bailey, the courtroom was packed. Reporters jostled for space, their pencils poised. Minnie stood in the dock, composed and silent. She pleaded guilty to 3 counts of burglary, 2 homes in Shepherd's Bush, one of them the residence of Annie Morris Hawkins, the other belonging to Herbert Tyson. The third charge, less detailed in the records, was likely linked to the same spree. The judge, perhaps unsure how to sentence a woman for such a crime, handed down a sentence of 9 months' imprisonment for each count. Whether these were to run concurrently or consecutively was a matter of some confusion. Some reports claimed she faced 18 months in total. Others suggested she would serve just 9. Either way, it was a light sentence by the standards of the day. A man convicted of the same offenses might have faced 5 years or more of hard labor, or even transportation, had the practice not been abolished decades earlier. The leniency was not unusual. Victorian courts often struggled with female offenders. The prevailing belief was that women lacked the moral agency to commit serious crimes on their own. They were seen as weak, emotional, easily led. When they did offend, it was assumed they had been coerced or corrupted. The idea of a woman as a calculating, independent criminal was not just rare, it was offensive to the social order. Minnie Pheby did not fit the script. She made no excuses. She named no accomplices. She did not weep or plead. She accepted her sentence with a calm that unsettled the court. There was no sign of remorse. No hint of shame. She was, as one observer put it, as cool as a cucumber. The press speculated wildly. Some suggested she was part of a gang. Others claimed she had been trained by a male mentor. A few hinted at a tragic backstory, poverty, abandonment, betrayal. But there was no evidence for any of it. Minnie herself offered nothing. She remained silent, letting others fill in the blanks. In the weeks that followed, her name became shorthand for a new kind of criminal. The lady burglar was born, not just as a figure of fear, but as a symbol of something more subversive. She challenged the boundaries of gender, class, and criminality. She was not just stealing jewelry. She was stealing attention, headlines, and a place in the public imagination. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished, into the grey walls of Wormwood Scrubs, where she would serve her sentence in silence. But Minnie Pheby was not finished. Not by a long shot. Chapter 6, Hard Labor. Wormwood Scrubs was not built for comfort. Opened in 1874, the prison stood like a red brick fortress on the western edge of London, its high walls and iron gates a grim reminder of the state's power to punish. It was here, behind those walls, that Minnie Pheby began her sentence in the spring of 1896. She would have arrived by prison van, shackled and silent, her name entered into the register alongside hundreds of others. Her black cashmere dress and stylish boots, so carefully chosen, so recently stolen, would have been taken from her, replaced with coarse prison garb. Her hair, if long, may have been cut. Her possessions, if any remained, inventoried and locked away. The regime was strict. Days began before dawn with the clang of a bell. Prisoners were marched to their work assignments, laundry, sewing, cleaning, or the dreaded oakum picking, which left fingers raw and lungs full of dust. Meals were meager, porridge, bread, weak tea. Talking was forbidden. Eyes were to be kept down. Disobedience was met with solitary confinement or the punishment cell. For women, the experience was doubly punishing. Victorian society viewed female criminals not just as lawbreakers, but as moral failures. They had transgressed not only the law, but the natural order. Reform was the goal, but it was reformed through silence, submission, and shame. Minnie Pheby did not fit the mold. She was not penitent. She was not broken. She served her time with the same quiet defiance that had marked her trial. There are no records of disciplinary infractions, but neither are there signs of contrition. She did not write letters to the court. She did not beg for early release. She waited. 9 months passed. Or perhaps 18. The records are unclear. But by early 1897, she was free again, released back into the city that had made her, and that she had made her own. She returned to Shepherd's Bush, or somewhere near it. The streets had not changed. The same houses stood in neat rows, their scullery windows still vulnerable, their owners still unsuspecting. The same constables walked the same beats. And somewhere, watching from a distance, was Detective Sergeant Knott. He had not forgotten her. He had seen something in her that others had missed, not just cunning but control. She had not panicked when caught. She had not confessed in a flood of tears. She had run, fought, and only surrendered when there was no other choice. He knew she would be back. And she was. Just 6 weeks after her release, Minnie Pheby was at it again. The details would soon become familiar. A house entered through a narrow window, valuables taken with precision, the scene left almost untouched. But this time, there was something different. The burglaries were bolder. The risks greater. The pattern unmistakable. Minnie had not been reformed. She had been refined. Chapter 7, Back with a Vengeance. Freedom for Minnie Pheby was not a clean slate. It was a return to familiar streets, familiar shadows, and familiar temptations. The city had not changed in her absence. Nor had she. 6 weeks. That was all it took. In early February 1897, the name Minnie Pheby once again appeared in the court listings at the Old Bailey. The charges were familiar: burglary, theft, and a prior conviction. The details, however, were more personal this time. Among the victims were Charlotte Bailey, a local dressmaker, and 2 women named Sarah and Emma Pheby. The court records are terse. They state that Minnie was accused of breaking into Charlotte Bailey's home and stealing a jacket and other articles. She was also charged with stealing a brooch, 7 shillings and 6pence, and other items from Sarah and Emma Pheby. The implication was clear: Minnie had turned her skills on those she knew. Whether Sarah and Emma were relatives, sisters, cousins, perhaps even her mother and aunt, was never clarified. But the surname was no coincidence. The press, already familiar with her story, seized on the return. "The lady burglar strikes again," one headline read. The tone was no longer one of astonishment, but of grim fascination. Minnie was no longer a novelty. She was a repeat offender, a woman who had defied the court's leniency and returned to her old ways without hesitation. Detective Sergeant Knott, who had arrested her the year before, was once again the man to bring her in. He had kept an eye on her since her release, perhaps suspecting that her silence in court had not been a sign of remorse, but of calculation. When the burglaries resumed, he knew where to look. The arrest was swift. Minnie was found in possession of stolen goods, including items traced back to the dressmaker's shop. She did not resist. She did not deny. She had been caught before. She knew the routine. In court, she pleaded guilty. The judge, less inclined to leniency this time, sentenced her to 12 months hard labor. It was a harsher punishment, but still light by the standards of the day. The maximum sentence for burglary was penal servitude for life. Minnie received a year. She showed no sign of distress. No tears. No protest. When the sentence was read, she stood motionless, her expression unreadable. The press noted her composure. The court noted her past. The public, once titillated by her exploits, now watched with a mixture of disapproval and reluctant admiration. Minnie Pheby had become something rare, a woman criminal who refused to be explained away. She was not a pawn. She was not a victim. She was a burglar, and she was good at it. As she was led from the courtroom, one reporter noted the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. It was not joy. It was not defiance. It was something else, something colder. A quiet satisfaction, perhaps, or a private joke. She had done it again. And she wasn't finished yet. Chapter 8, Cat and Mouse. By the time Minnie Pheby emerged from prison in early 1898, she was no longer just a curiosity. She was a known quantity, an anomaly in the eyes of the law, a fascination to the press, and a problem for the police. Detective Sergeant Henry Knott, who had twice arrested her, was not inclined to forget. He had watched her slip through the cracks once before. He had no intention of letting it happen again. But Minnie was nothing if not adaptable. She had learned from her mistakes. She had studied the system from the inside. She knew its rhythms, its blind spots, its assumptions. She knew that the courts still struggled to believe in her, that they saw her as an exception, not a threat, that they would hesitate before handing down a sentence that matched her crimes. She used that hesitation like a crowbar. For a time, she kept a low profile. There are no records of her activities in 1898 or 1899. No arrests. No trials. No headlines. But the silence was deceptive. In the background, a new pattern of burglaries began to emerge, subtle, precise, and eerily familiar. Homes in Shepherd's Bush and Hammersmith were being entered in the dead of night. Valuables vanished without a trace. The scenes were clean. The entry points small. The police suspected a gang. Not suspected otherwise. He had seen this before. The press, too, began to speculate. Was the lady burglar back? Had she returned to her old haunts, her old habits? Or was this a copycat, inspired by her legend? The truth, as it turned out, was simpler. Minnie Pheby had never left. She had simply become better. She no longer relied on chance. She planned. She watched. She waited. She found an empty house in the heart of her old territory and made it her base. She lived there like a ghost, sleeping on a stolen scrap of carpet, cooking on a borrowed stove, storing her loot in rooms no one entered. By day, she was invisible. By night, she was unstoppable. She timed her movements to the changing of the police shifts. She knew when the streets would be quiet, when the constables would be distracted. She disguised herself as a maid, donning a clean white apron and walking the streets at dawn with the confidence of someone who belonged. No one looked twice. She was no longer just a burglar. She was a strategist. Knott, for his part, was patient. He knew she would slip. Knew that pride or greed or boredom would push her too far. He kept his ear to the ground, his eyes on the shadows. And when the moment came, he was ready. In early 1900, the pattern broke. The burglaries became bolder. Some were committed in daylight. One victim was home at the time. Another returned to find her jewelry gone and her back door ajar. The press, sensing a story, pounced. The lady burglar was back. And this time, she wasn't hiding. Chapter 9, The Final Heists. By the turn of the century, Minnie Pheby was no longer a mystery. She was a known figure in the criminal underworld of West London, a name whispered in police stations and printed in the columns of the popular press. But in early 1900, she returned to the public eye with a vengeance. The burglaries began again, this time with a new boldness. No longer confined to the dead of night, some were carried out in broad daylight. The homes of Shepherd's Bush and Hammersmith were once again under siege. Windows were found ajar, jewelry boxes emptied, coats and boots spirited away. The method was unmistakable. The police, and especially Detective Sergeant Knott, knew exactly who they were dealing with. But Minnie had evolved. She was no longer the impulsive young woman caught red-handed in a kitchen. She had become meticulous. She had learned to use the city itself as a tool. Her base of operations was an abandoned house, nestled among the very homes she targeted. From there, she launched her raids, returning before dawn to stash her loot and disappear behind a locked door. She lived like a phantom. By day, she was silent. By night, she moved with purpose. She knew the constable's schedules, the habits of her neighbors, the weaknesses in locks and latches. She carried a white apron in her bundle, slipping it on after a job to pass as a domestic servant on an early errand. No one questioned her. No one looked twice. But even the most careful plans can unravel. In April 1900, Minnie struck twice in quick succession, first at 23, Askew Crescent, then at 251, Uxbridge Road. Both homes were entered with her usual finesse. Both were relieved of valuables. But this time, Knott was ready. He had been watching. He had noticed the pattern. He had seen the signs. And when he spotted a flicker of light in a supposedly empty house, he acted. With constables stationed at the front and rear, not entered the property. Inside, he found Minnie, wrapping up her haul. She ran, as she always did, but the net had already closed. She was caught in the next garden, her bundle still in hand. The arrest was swift. The evidence overwhelming. The press, once again, had their story. At the Clerkenwell sessions, Minnie stood trial for the two most recent burglaries. Not testified that at least 15 homes in the area had been burgled in the same manner, all bearing the hallmarks of Phoebe's technique. The court listened, skeptical but intrigued. The sentence was 18 months hard labor. It was the harshest punishment she had received to date, but still lenient by comparison to what a man might have faced. The judge, perhaps still unwilling to fully accept the scope of her crimes, seemed to treat her as an aberration rather than a threat. Minnie, for her part, was unmoved. As the sentence was read, she turned to the court and asked with a smirk, "Is that all?" It was a question that echoed beyond the courtroom. Was that all the law could do? Was that all society could muster in response to a woman who had time and again outwitted the police, defied expectations, and carved out a place for herself in a world that had no room for her? Minnie Pheby was led away once more. But her question lingered. And though she would serve her time, the legend of the lady burglar was far from over. Chapter 10, Is That All? The courtroom at Clerkenwell Sessions was quiet as the sentence was handed down. 18 months hard labor. A murmur passed through the gallery, some surprised at the severity, others at its restraint. But Minnie Pheby, standing in the dock for the third time in 4 years, barely blinked. She turned to the magistrate, her voice clear and unflinching. "Is that all?" The words hung in the air, sharp as a blade. It was not a plea. It was not a protest. It was a challenge. The press seized on the moment. Headlines blared, "Lady Burglar laughs at the law, defiant thief jests at justice." The public, already familiar with her name, now had a quote to remember her by. It was the final flourish in a career defined by audacity. Minnie was sent once more to Wormwood Scrubs. She was 24 years old. This was her 4th sentence. The police, particularly Detective Sergeant Knott, considered the case closed. The burglaries in Shepherd's Bush and Hammersmith ceased. The neighborhood exhaled. But what became of Minnie Pheby after that final conviction is a matter of speculation. The records fall silent. No further arrests. No more trials. No death certificate, no marriage record, no emigration file that can be definitively linked to her name. It is as though she vanished, slipping through the cracks of history as deftly as she once slipped through scullery windows. Some believed she reformed, that the weight of repeated incarceration finally wore her down. Others whispered that she changed her name, moved to another city, perhaps even another country, and continued her trade under a new identity. A few suggested she married, settled, disappeared into domestic obscurity. But those who knew her, those who had chased her across gardens and rooftops, who had watched her stand trial without flinching, doubted it. Minnie Pheby was not the type to fade quietly. Her story, though brief, left a mark. She had exposed the blind spots in a justice system that underestimated women. She had challenged the assumptions of a society that believed femininity was incompatible with criminality. She had shown that a woman could be as daring, as cunning, as relentless as any man. And she had done it all without apology. In the years that followed, the image of the lady burglar would become a trope in fiction and theater. But Minnie was no fiction. She was real. Flesh and blood. Boots and bone. A woman who climbed walls, picked locks, and walked alone through the gaslit streets of London with a bundle of stolen goods under her arm. She asked only one question of the court, and perhaps of the world: is that all? Chapter 11, The Empty House. By the spring of 1900, Minnie Pheby had perfected her craft. She no longer relied on chance or impulse. Her burglaries were not the reckless acts of a desperate girl, but the calculated operations of a seasoned professional. She had learned the rhythms of the city, the habits of its residents, and the blind spots of its police. She had learned, above all, how to disappear. Her base of operations was a house on Askew Crescent. It was unoccupied, unremarkable, and to the casual observer, entirely unimportant. But to Minnie, it was a fortress. She had entered it as she entered all her targets, through a scullery window left unlatched, no more than 9 inches wide. She brought nothing with her but a bundle of tools and a servant's apron. Once inside, she made herself at home. She stole a square of carpet from the house next door and laid it on the floor of the top room. She cooked her meals on a borrowed stove. She stored her loot in the empty cupboards and drawers. By day, she was a ghost. By night, she was a shadow. The house gave her cover, but it also gave her confidence. From its windows, she could watch the street. She could see who left for work and when. She could track the constable's patrols, noting the moments when the beat changed and the streets fell quiet. She could plan. Her method was simple. She struck in the early hours, when the city was at its stillest. She carried her tools in a cloth bundle, wrapped in a white apron. After each job, she would don the apron and walk the streets as a maid on an early errand. No one questioned her. No one looked twice. She was not greedy. She took only what she could carry: jewelry, watches, purses, coats, boots. She preferred items that could be sold quickly, broken down, or worn. She was careful not to leave a mess. She closed the windows behind her. She left no fingerprints, no footprints, no trace. But the city was watching. Detective Sergeant Knott had not forgotten her. He had seen her vanish before. He had watched her reappear. And now, as the burglaries resumed, he saw her hand in every one. He began to patrol the streets of Shepherd's Bush with new purpose. He studied the scenes of the crimes. He noted the patterns, the small windows, the clean exits, the missing jewelry and clothing, the silence. And then one morning he saw it, a flicker of light in a house that should have been dark. He summoned his men. They surrounded the building. He knocked on the door. Inside, Minnie was packing her bundle. She ran, as she always did. She leapt the garden wall, as she always had. But this time, the constables were waiting. She was caught, again. The house was searched. The stolen goods were catalogued. The method was revealed. The press had their story. At the Clerkenwell sessions, Knott testified that at least 15 homes had been burgled in the same manner. The judge listened, skeptical. A woman? Alone? 15 houses. Minnie stood in the dock, silent. The sentence was read, 18 months hard labor. She turned to the court and smiled. Is that all? Chapter 12, the fourth sentence. The courtroom was quiet. Minnie Pheby stood in the dock, her hands clasped behind her back, her chin lifted. She had been here before. The faces changed, the charges shifted, but the ritual remained the same. The reading of the indictment. The murmured plea. The rustle of papers. The weight of the law, dressed in robes and wigs, bearing down on a woman who refused to bow. The charges were clear. 2 counts of burglary, 23, Askew Crescent and 251, Uxbridge Road. Both committed in the early hours. Both executed with the same precision. The same narrow entry points. The same absence of noise. The same vanishing act. Detective Sergeant Knott took the stand. He spoke with the calm of a man who had waited years for this moment. He described the pattern. The 15 houses. The identical methods. The empty house used as a base. The stolen goods recovered. The timing of the police shifts. The apron disguise. He did not embellish. He did not need to. The magistrate listened, frowning. He asked questions. Could one woman really have done all this? Was there no accomplice? No man behind the scenes? Knott shook his head. She worked alone. The court shifted. A murmur passed through the gallery. A woman burglar was one thing. A woman mastermind was another. Minnie said nothing. The sentence was pronounced, 18 months hard labor. She smiled. Is that all? The words echoed through the courtroom. A gasp. A pause. Then silence. The magistrate did not respond. He simply nodded to the bailiff. The gavel fell. Minnie was led away. It was her 4th sentence. 6 months. 9 months. 12. Now 18. Each time, the stakes had risen. Each time, she had returned. But something had changed. The press, once breathless with fascination, now sounded a different note. The novelty had worn thin. The headlines were smaller. The tone more weary. The lady burglar had become a repeat offender. The public, once titillated, now frowned. Still, the facts remained. She had outwitted the police for months. She had lived in plain sight. She had turned the city into her hunting ground. And when caught, she had not begged. She had not wept. She had asked a question. Is that all? It was not defiance. It was calculation. She knew the limits of the law. She knew the boundaries of belief. She knew that as a woman, she would not be believed capable of more. She had been right. But the question lingered. Was that all? Or was there more to come? Chapter 13, Vanishing Point. When the cell door closed behind her in 1900, Minnie Pheby was 24 years old. She had spent the better part of 5 years slipping between the cracks of London's criminal justice system, arrested, sentenced, released, and returned. Each time, she emerged sharper, bolder, more elusive. Each time, she returned to the shadows. But after her fourth conviction, the shadows swallowed her whole. There are no further records. No more trials. No more headlines. No more sightings. The lady burglar, once the subject of breathless newspaper columns and courtroom whispers, simply vanished. The silence is deafening. In the years that followed, the world changed. Queen Victoria died in 1901, and with her, the century. The Edwardian era brought new fashions, new technologies, new anxieties. The suffragettes marched. The motor car arrived. The city grew taller, louder, faster. But of Minnie Pheby, there was no trace. Theories abound. Some believed she reformed. That the final sentence broke her spirit, or at least her resolve. That she found work, perhaps under a new name, and lived out her days in quiet anonymity. Others imagined she changed cities, or countries, or identities, slipping into the underworld of another place, another life. A few whispered that she had died young, her body unclaimed, her name misspelled in some forgotten register. The truth is unknowable. What remains is the record, for convictions, 15 burglaries, a handful of names and addresses, and a single unforgettable question. Is that all? It was a question for the court, yes. But it was also a question for history. For the society that could not decide whether to punish her or admire her. For the readers who devoured her story and then moved on. For the city that built its walls high and its windows narrow, and still could not keep her out. Minnie Pheby was not a legend. She was not a symbol. She was a woman. Flesh and blood. Clever, agile, and unrepentant. She lived in a world that offered her few choices, and she made her own. And then, she disappeared. Chapter 14, The Woman Who Wasn't There. In the years after Minnie Pheby's final conviction, the city she once haunted moved on. The streets of Shepherd's Bush filled with new faces. The houses she had once burgled were repainted, relet, forgotten. The constables who had chased her retired or were reassigned. Detective Sergeant Knott, her most persistent pursuer, faded from the record. The world that had once been so certain of her guilt, so fascinated by her defiance, turned its attention elsewhere. But the question remained, where did she go? The archives offer no answer. No death certificate bears her name. No marriage record, no emigration file, no further criminal charge. The census of 1901, taken just months after her release, lists no Minnie Pheby in London. If she was there, she was someone else. Perhaps she changed her name. Perhaps she married. Perhaps she boarded a ship and sailed for Canada, or Australia, or the Cape. Perhaps she died in a workhouse, or a hospital, or a back alley, her name misspelled, her story lost. Or perhaps she simply stopped. It would not have been the first time a thief disappeared. London's underworld was full of ghosts, men and women who slipped through the cracks, who lived and died without ceremony. But Minnie was different. She had been seen, named, known. She had stood in the dock and faced the court with a smirk. She had made herself unforgettable. And then she was gone. The silence is not proof of redemption, nor is it proof of ruin. It is only silence. A blank space where a life once was. For historians, it is a frustration. For storytellers, a gift. The absence invites invention. It allows for endings of every kind. The reformed woman, the runaway, the recidivist, the recluse. Each is possible. Each is plausible. Each says more about the teller than the told. But this is not a novel. It is a history. and history must live with its gaps. What we know is this: Minnie Pheby was born in 1876. She was first arrested in 1896. She was last seen in 1900. She served 4 sentences. She committed at least 15 burglaries. She worked alone. She never denied it. She never apologized. And then she vanished. The woman who once climbed through windows, who ran across rooftops, who turned the city into her playground, became a rumor. A memory. A name in a ledger. The woman who wasn't there. Chapter 15, The Others. Minnie Pheby was not alone. She was singular in her style, her independence, her refusal to conform. But she was not the only woman to walk the line between poverty and crime, between invisibility and infamy. In the alleys and attics of Victorian London, others moved as she did, quietly, cleverly, and against the grain. Some were caught. Most were not. There was Lydia Lloyd, who in 1879 was sentenced to over 10 years imprisonment after a decade of burglaries. She had been convicted 4 times before the court finally decided she was beyond redemption. Her name, like Minnie's, flickered briefly in the press before fading into the archives. There was Sarah Hooper, who stood in the dock beside her husband in 1882 and claimed, "All that I have done has been under my husband's instructions." The court believed her. She received 6 months. He received 5 years. There were the women of the 40 Elephants, an all-female gang that operated out of the Elephant and Castle district. They specialized in shoplifting, not burglary, but their methods were no less sophisticated. They infiltrated homes as maids, gathered intelligence, and struck with precision. They worked in teams, coordinated and disciplined, their loot fenced through a network of trusted contacts. They were not romanticized. They were not forgiven. But they were, for a time, unstoppable. The press called them lady thieves, female marauders, petticoat plunderers. The language was always gendered, always tinged with disbelief. A man who stole was a criminal. A woman who stole was a curiosity. The courts, too, struggled to categorize them. The law allowed for harsh sentences, but judges hesitated. A woman burglar was an affront to the natural order. To punish her too severely was to admit she was capable. To let her go was to risk scandal. Minnie Pheby understood this. She played the part when it suited her, quiet, well-dressed, deferential. But she never claimed coercion. She never blamed a man. She never asked for mercy. She was not a victim. She was not a pawn. She was a participant. And in that, she joined a lineage of women who refused to be defined by the roles assigned to them. Women who stole not out of desperation, but out of defiance. Women who saw the locked door and chose the window. They were not many, but they were there. And Minnie Pheby was one of them. Chapter 16, The Art of Disappearance. There is a difference between being forgotten and choosing to vanish. Minnie Pheby understood this. She had spent years mastering the art of absence, slipping through windows, evading constables, leaving behind only questions. Her life was a study in negative space. What she did not say, where she did not go, who she did not become. After 1900, she left no trace. No marriage. No death. No further crimes. No letters, no memoirs, no final confession. The woman who once stood in the dock and mocked the court with a smirk and a question simply ceased to be. But disappearance, too, is a kind of authorship. It is a decision to withhold. To deny the world its ending. To leave the story unfinished. For the police, it was a failure. For the press, a disappointment. For the historians, a puzzle. But for Minnie, it may have been the only freedom left. She had lived her life under surveillance, watched, followed, written about, judged. Her name had become a headline. Her face, a sketch. Her body, a subject of fascination. Her crimes, a spectacle. To vanish was to reclaim control. Perhaps she boarded a ship under another name. Perhaps she found work in a town where no one asked questions. Perhaps she lived quietly, anonymously, in a room above a shop or behind a curtain in a boarding house. Perhaps she watched the world forget her, and smiled. Or perhaps she did not survive. The streets were not kind to women like her. The work was dangerous. The risks constant. The margins narrow. A fall from a rooftop. A knife in the dark. A winter without shelter. Any of these could have ended her story. But if she died as she lived, unclaimed, unnamed, unrepentant. The city moved on. The courts filled with new defendants. The newspapers found new scandals. The name Minnie Pheby faded from memory. But the silence she left behind remains. It is the silence of a woman who refused to explain herself, who refused to be defined by the roles offered to her, who refused to give the world the satisfaction of a neat conclusion. She was not caught again. She was not reformed. She was not redeemed. She was gone. And in her absence, she became something more than a criminal. She became a question that still waits for an answer. Conclusion: a window left open. There are stories that end with a reckoning. A final act. A reckoning in the dock, or the grave, or the page. Minnie Pheby's story is not one of them. She came and went like a shadow. She left behind no memoir, no confession, no legacy of reform. What remains are fragments, a handful of court records, a few newspaper sketches, the memory of a woman who climbed through windows and refused to explain herself. In the end, it is not the crimes that linger. It is the silence. The silence of a woman who would not be contained by the roles laid out for her, who did not ask for sympathy, or forgiveness, or understanding, who did not wait for permission. She was not a heroine. She was not a villain. She was not a symbol. She was a woman who made choices, some reckless, some deliberate, all her own. And in that, she left a mark. Not in monuments or headlines, but in the questions she raised. About who is seen and who is believed. About what it means to be respectable. About the spaces women are allowed to occupy, and the ones they must take for themselves. Minnie Pheby took the ones left unguarded. The ones left unlocked. The ones no one thought a woman would dare to enter. She left no trace. Only the faint outline of a life lived on the edge of the law, and the memory of a voice in a courtroom, asking the question that still echoes more than a century later. Is that all? Epilogue. Legacy of a lady burglar. History has a habit of forgetting women like Minnie Pheby. Not because they were unremarkable, far from it, but because they refused to conform to the roles that history prefers. They did not marry well, or die tragically, or leave behind letters to be anthologized. They left instead a trail of broken locks, court transcripts, and unanswered questions. After her final conviction in 1900, Minnie Pheby disappeared from the public record. No further trials. No prison registers. No death notice. No grave that bears her name. Whether she changed her identity, left the country, or simply faded into the anonymity of working-class London life, we cannot say. But her story lingers. In the decades that followed, the figure of the female criminal became a staple of popular culture. The lady burglar appeared in penny dreadfuls, stage melodramas, and eventually silent films. She was seductive, cunning, always one step ahead. She was fiction, of course, but she had a precedent. Minnie Pheby was not the only woman to challenge the boundaries of Victorian respectability, but she was among the few to do so with such clarity of purpose. She did not steal to feed her children. She did not claim coercion. She did not apologize. She acted with intent, and she accepted the consequences with a shrug. In doing so, she exposed the contradictions of her time. A society that insisted women were too delicate for crime, yet too dangerous to trust. A legal system that punished women less harshly, not out of mercy, but out of disbelief. A press that could not decide whether to condemn her or admire her. She was, in the end, a woman who lived on her own terms. In a world that offered her few choices, she made her own. She chose risk over obedience, independence over invisibility. She climbed through windows when doors were closed to her. And when the court tried to make sense of her, when the judge read out her sentence, she asked the only question that mattered. Is that all? It was a question for the court, yes, but also for the world that had tried to define her. A world that had failed to see her coming, and never quite knew what to do with her once she arrived. Minnie Pheby may be gone, but her shadow remains, long quiet, and just out of reach. Appendix, Story Outline. Minnie Pheby's Crimes, Timeline and Details. Early activity, circa 1895, Minnie Pheby likely began her criminal activities in her late teens, although documentation is scarce. A note in her February 1897 Old Bailey indictment refers to a previous conviction of felony on February 14, 1896. This suggests that Pheby had been convicted of a lesser offense, perhaps larceny or housebreaking, prior to her major 1896 burglaries. Contemporary reports in 1900 mention that she had already undergone a sentence of 6 months hard labor for a prior offense. No Old Bailey trial in 1895 is recorded for Pheby, so this likely was a summary conviction at a police court or quarter sessions in late 1895, resulting in a short prison term. The details of that early case, possibly a theft from an employer or acquaintance, remain unclear, but it established Pheby as a known offender by 1896. February 24, 1896, first major burglary spree and arrest. In the winter of 1896, at age 20, Minnie Pheby committed a series of nighttime burglaries in the Shepherd's Bush district of West London. On the night of 23 to 24 February 1896, she brazenly burgled 2 neighbouring houses in one night. The home of Mrs. Annie Morris Hawkins, at 2 Cornwallis Road, Shepherd's Bush, from which Pheby stole a clock and other household items. The residence of Mr. Herbert Tyson, sometimes reported as Herbert Fryson, due to a likely spelling error in one source, where she stole a gold brooch and various valuables. Phebe's modus operandi stunned the police and press. Detective Sergeant Henry Knott of the Metropolitan Police's T Division had been investigating a cluster of mysterious burglaries in the area, burglaries notable for the thief's ability to get in and out without disturbing occupants and to squeeze through very small openings. In the early hours of February 24th, D.S. Knott was patrolling Askew Road when he noticed an inexplicable light in the kitchen of Mrs. Hawkins's house, number 4 Askew Road, at around 3 a.m. Knowing the household usually retired early, Knott grew suspicious. He quietly roused the occupants and positioned constables at the front and rear of the property. Entering the home, he surprised Minnie Pheby in the kitchen, in the act of gathering up portable loot. Pheby was armed with a bundle of stolen items from the 2 houses she had hit that night. Upon being discovered, Pheby attempted to escape. Demonstrating the cat-like agility that would earn her comparisons to a female Sykes and even Catwoman, she dashed out the back door and vaulted over a garden wall in an effort to flee. A constable stationed in the adjacent yard caught her as she dropped down. This dramatic arrest made instant headlines. The press, initially expecting a gang of male expert burglars, was astonished to learn the culprit was a young woman dressed like a respectable lady. Pheby was found wearing a brown jacket with fashionably puffed sleeves and a black cashmere dress, looking for all the world like a demure housemaid, except that her boots and clothes were themselves stolen property from the earlier burglary that night. In custody, the 20-year-old allegedly confessed to being responsible for the weeks-long string of baffling break-ins in the area, some dozen or more incidents that had left the police perplexed. March 1896, Old Bailey trial. Minnie Pheby was swiftly brought to trial at the Old Bailey. Facing 3 indictments for the burglaries, she pleaded guilty to all charges. Her guilty plea and the unusual circumstances may have influenced the judge's relatively lenient sentence. She was sentenced to 9 months' imprisonment on each count. According to one source, these were to run consecutively, which would amount to 18 months in total, although another contemporary account implies the total was 9 months, suggesting the sentences may have been effectively concurrent. In either case, the punishment was far milder than the norm for multiple burglaries. A man in her position could have expected several years in prison or even penal servitude for life. Victorian law regarded burglary, defined as breaking into an occupied dwelling at night, as a severe felony, legally and morally comparable to violent crimes, yet Phebe's gender afforded her an unexpected degree of mercy. Pheby served her sentence at Wormwood Scrubs Prison in West London, a newly built prison that normally housed male convicts, but which also had facilities for female prisoners serving short sentences. She was released in late 1896, around the age of 21. Early 1897, second spate of burglaries, Minnie Pheby lost little time returning to crime. Within about 6 weeks of her release, i.e. by January 1897, similar burglaries resumed in the Shepherd's Bush area, and not again suspected Phebe's hand. On February 8, 1897, Pheby was caught stealing clothes and jewelry from a dressmaker in Shepherd's Bush. Old Bailey records identify the premises as the home of Charlotte Bailey, dressmaker. When arrested, Pheby was also charged with having stolen a brooch, cash amounting to 7/6d, 7 shillings and 6 pence, and other articles from Sarah Pheby and Emma Pheby. The identical surname suggests these individuals were her relatives, possibly her mother and sister, meaning that Minnie may have even stolen from her own family. This paints a picture of a young woman possibly estranged or desperate enough to victimize those close to her, though details of that incident remain scant in the records. Once again, D.S. Knott was responsible for her capture. It appears he had kept her under surveillance after the 1896 release. Faye's rearrest so soon after serving her term solidified her reputation as an incorrigible criminal. In press coverage, journalists marveled that a woman would not only commit one burglary, but repeatedly relapse into crime. Some reports dubbed her a phenomenon and a female Sykes, comparing her to Dickens' fictional burglar Bill Sikes, with a gender twist. At her second Old Bailey trial, March 1897, Pheby again pleaded guilty. This time she was sentenced to 12 months hard labor. Her prior conviction from 1896 was formally referenced in court, but even as a repeat burglar her sentence remained low by contemporary standards, indicative of the era's double standard in punishing female criminals. Pheby served this year-long sentence, likely again at Wormwood Scrubs or another local women's prison, and was released near the end of 1897 or in early 1898. 1898 to 1899, interim period. After her 1897 release, Minnie Pheby seems to have briefly disappeared from public view. There were no immediate reports of burglaries attributed to her in 1898 or most of 1899. We do not know whether she attempted to go straight during this time or if she simply operated more discreetly. It's possible she took up petty thieving or other inconspicuous crimes to subsist. However, by early 1900, a fresh wave of burglaries in West London suggested that Pheby was active again, honing her techniques to new heights of boldness. Spring 1900, daylight burglaries and final crime wave. In March-April 1900, a crime spree hit the neighborhoods of Shepherd's Bush and Hammersmith, marked by at least 15 burglaries with a familiar modus operandi. Detective Knott noted that the burglar now felt so confident that some break-ins occurred in broad daylight, and the thief left almost no clues. Residents would return home to find their houses quietly ransacked. Police suspected Pheby was back at work, acting alone. They increased vigilance in the area, and Knott in particular carefully studied the pattern of entries. He observed that at many of the burgled houses, a very small rear or side window, around 8 to 9 inches wide, had been unfastened and left open, the signature of a burglar who could contort through tiny gaps. Phebe's final undoing came when she grew even more audacious. She selected a row of houses on Askew Crescent, near her old haunts, and identified that number 23 Askew Crescent was unoccupied. She covertly made her base in this empty house by entering through a window, then used it to conduct raids on neighboring homes. By living as a squatter in the vacant house, Pheby could lie low during the daytime and strike at night, and eventually in early mornings. She even furnished her hideout with stolen items. For example, she took a carpet from the house next door to serve as her bed on the top floor. From this base, she successfully hit multiple targets, including the house at 23, Askew Crescent itself and another at 251, Uxbridge Road, among others. A critical tactic Pheby employed was exploiting the police shift change at dawn. Knowing that constables changed duty around 6 a.m., she would finish a burglary and then hide in the victim's coal cellar until the night patrols ended. Then, carrying her haul, she'd emerge during the dawn light. Wearing a stolen white maid's apron over her clothes, she would stroll casually down the street appearing to be a servant girl on an early errand, arousing no suspicion as she walked the short distance back to her secret lair. This ruse allowed her to move stolen goods in plain sight of any passers-by or policemen changing shifts. However, by mid-April 1900, Detective Knott finally caught Pheby again. The precise date is not given in sources, but it was likely in April 1900 after a covert surveillance operation. According to the New Zealand Herald account, May 19, 1900, Knott spotted a flicker of light in a house on Askew Road where the residents were known to be abed, the same scenario as 1896. He called in constables and trapped Pheby as she was gathering loot, apparently in the Uxbridge Road house, in the small hours. She attempted to run but was surrounded and arrested for the third time. The subsequent search revealed the extent of her recent operations. The empty house was found stocked with a variety of property from many burglaries, and her methods, the timing with the police beat changes and the apron disguise, were fully revealed under interrogation. May 1900, final sentencing. Is that all? Minnie Pheby's last trial took place at the Clerkenwell Sessions, Middlesex Sessions House, in May 1900, as her offences fell under the jurisdiction of the county sessions rather than the Central Criminal Court. In this hearing, the 24-year-old Pheby was convicted on 2 counts of housebreaking, daytime burglary, at 23, Askew Crescent and 251, Uxbridge Road. Detective Sergeant Knott testified about the series of unsolved burglaries, 15 in total, that he firmly attributed to Phebe's peculiar style. Despite the scope of her crimes and her record, the court remained hesitant to impose a draconian penalty on a woman. The chairman, Mr. McConnell QC, sentenced Phebe to 18 months hard labor, her longest sentence yet, but still far below the possible maximum. She could have been sentenced to penal servitude for several years. Phebe's reaction became legend. She derisively asked the court, "Is that all?" when the 18-month term was announced. This contemptuous quip, reported in the press, encapsulated her bold, unrepentant persona and hinted that she felt untouchable, or at least unimpressed by what she viewed as a trivial punishment. Minnie Pheby served her final sentence, 1900 to 1901, at Wormwood Scrubs. After her release, likely in late 1901, assuming full term served, she effectively vanishes from the public record. No further arrests or documented crimes under her name are known, and newspapers do not mention her again. Section 7 discusses the theories and scant evidence about her later life, but effectively 1900 marked the end of Minnie Pheby's infamous burglary career in the historical record. Early life, family, and social background. Family and upbringing. Surprisingly little is known about Minnie Pheby's personal life before her crimes. Official records list her birth year as 1876 and indicate her given name as Minnie, which could be a nickname common for Mary or Wilhelmina, but in her case Minnie appears to be the name used in legal records. No contemporary newspapers delve into her childhood, and her family only surfaces in the record due to the 1897 theft from Sarah and Emma Pheby. These names raise the possibility that Minnie's immediate family included a woman named Sarah, quite possibly her mother, and another named Emma, perhaps a sister or aunt. The fact that Minnie targeted them for theft suggests estrangement or desperation. Perhaps family ties had frayed, or she had been cast out from her home due to her criminal behavior. If Sarah Pheby was her mother, it might indicate Minnie's father was absent or deceased by 1897, common for poorer Victorian families, where fathers could be lost to illness, work accidents, or other misfortunes. It's also possible that Sarah and Emma were extended family or former employers, but the shared surname and the context implies a familial link. Without detailed census or baptism records explicitly tied to Minnie, one can only speculate that she was born into a working-class family in London. The surname Pheby is uncommon but found in UK records of the period. The Digital Panopticon Index suggests she was London-born. Residence. The known crimes all took place in Shepherd's Bush and Hammersmith, which were relatively new suburban developments in West London. It's likely Minnie grew up in or near this area. Shepherd's Bush in the late 19th century had pockets of working-class housing not far from middle-class villas and terraces, making it a ripe area for domestic servants and also for burglars. Minnie may have lived in modest lodgings or with family in that district. If she worked as a servant girl or shop assistant, both plausible occupations for someone of her background, her workplace might have been in the same vicinity. Education and work. Under the Elementary Education Act 1880, schooling was compulsory in England up to age 10, later raised to 13. Thus, Minnie probably attended a local elementary school in the 1880s, gaining basic literacy. Indeed, her ability to read and case houses, as well as her clever self-presentation in court, implies at least a rudimentary education. After leaving school, likely by the early 1890s, a girl of her status would typically enter service or low-wage employment. In Phebe's case, newspapers described her as a quiet, hard-working young woman in the eyes of employers prior to her criminal notoriety. This strongly suggests she worked as a domestic servant, maid, or possibly a seamstress/dressmaker's apprentice in the years before and between her known crimes. Such jobs would have given her intimate knowledge of household routines, layouts, and weak points, knowledge that could be repurposed for burglary. It would also explain how she could appear to be a respectable young woman, polite, petite, and industrious, all the while secretly planning nightly raids. In Victorian London, servants often lived with their employers. If Phebe held such positions, it would have provided cover for her to scout valuables and perhaps even access keys or knowledge of window locks. It's also conceivable that Minnie had underworld contacts. The ease with which she fenced stolen goods and moved around suggests she knew where to sell valuables and how to avoid detection. West London had its share of pawnbrokers and fences willing to pay cash for jewelry or clothing with no questions asked. Some female thieves of the era were connected to bigger criminal networks, though all evidence indicates Phebe largely worked alone. Personal life. almost nothing is directly recorded about Phoebe's personal relationships outside of crime. No mention of any husband or children appears in the trials or news. She is consistently referred to as girl, young woman, or female prisoner, with the surname Pheby, indicating she was unmarried during her crime years. This distinguishes her from many other women criminals of the time who, if caught, often claimed to be influenced by husbands or male accomplices. Minnie did not make such claims, and authorities could not identify any male Fagin or partner in her crimes. She operated independently, an unusual and thus barely comprehensible situation for Victorian observers. One reporter noted that no one seems to know what led this woman to adopt the dangerous and precarious career of a burglar, implying that no obvious cause, like a corrupt husband or dire poverty, was publicly known. We can infer that Phoebe's decision to become a thief was probably driven by economic hardship and personal circumstance. Victorian London's working-class women often faced bleak prospects, low-paid labor, potential homelessness or prostitution if unemployed, and little social support. For an unmarried woman without a steady family support, crime could appear to offer a risky escape from poverty. Minnie's case suggests a strong-willed individual who chose to take rather than starve or submit. One contemporary account imagined her as a young, active, well-built woman of daring and determined character once she set herself on the criminal path. Psychological profile. Accounts of Minnie Pheby consistently highlight her fearlessness and composure. At 20, she was described as exhibiting sang-froid, cold-blooded coolness, more typical of male criminals. After her capture, she reportedly boasted of her deeds, showing no diffidence in confessing that she alone had perpetrated the burglaries that stumped the police. In court, she was defiant, interrupting the proceedings and quipping at the judge. This self-assurance suggests a certain anti-authoritarian streak and perhaps a desire for notoriety, or at least a lack of shame. It is also possible that imprisonment further hardened her resolve. After each release, she reoffended with bolder tactics, indicating she was neither reformed nor deterred. In sum, while hard evidence about Minnie Pheby's early life is limited, the available information portrays a young woman of modest background who rejected the subservient role expected of her. She turned the skills and knowledge gleaned from a life in service or manual labor into tools for burglary. By charting her own criminal path, she severed ties with conventional Victorian femininity, and perhaps even with her own family, to become, in the words of one paper, the one-in-a-million woman who chose to become a housebreaker, paraphrasing the astonishment of the time. Female criminality in Victorian London, context and comparisons. Minnie Pheby's story cannot be fully understood without examining the broader context of Victorian attitudes toward women and crime. In the late 19th century, female criminals were simultaneously stigmatized and sensationalized. Rarity of female burglars. Property crime was common in Victorian cities, but burglary was considered an almost exclusively male domain. Burglary, legally defined as breaking into an occupied dwelling at night with intent to steal, was culturally associated with a high degree of physical strength, courage, and criminal professionalism, traits Victorians stereotypically assigned only to men. Women thieves typically engaged in what were seen as smaller or more opportunistic crimes: shoplifting, pickpocketing, prostitution-related theft, or domestic theft, stealing from employers, activities thought to require less brute force or seen as extensions of women's domestic roles. The notion of a lone woman climbing into strangers' houses at night, as Pheby did, was so far from Victorian gender norms that many refused to believe it. As historian Eloise Moss notes, late 19th century society was more willing to entertain elaborate theories of male gangs or male Svengali figures than to accept evidence of a solo lady burglar. Societal attitudes and leniency. When women did commit serious crimes, the Victorian criminal justice system often interpreted them through a patriarchal lens. Women defendants were typically seen as less culpable. They were viewed either as morally weaker, and thus easily led astray by men, or as mentally unbalanced. Courts were inclined to show chivalric leniency to female criminals, especially when their crimes could be framed as the result of male influence or desperate circumstances. This is reflected in sentencing patterns. Between 1860 and 1939, 1,184 women were tried for burglary in England and Wales, but their punishments were usually far lighter than men's. Judges often handed women short prison terms even for repeated offenses. Phebe's case is a prime example. After multiple burglaries, her longest sentence was 18 months. Only in the most extreme cases did women receive very long terms. Lydia Lloyd, one of the few other well-known Victorian female burglars, had 4 convictions by 1879 and was finally given a decade in prison. She was the exception. The fact that even Pheby only got 18 months for a string of burglaries in 1900 highlights how disbelieving the system remained about female criminals' capabilities. Many women capitalized on these attitudes. A common defense for female burglars or robbers was to claim male coercion. One cited case is Sarah Hooper, tried in 1882 alongside her husband for burglary. She implored the judge, "All that I have done has been under my husband's instructions." The outcome? Sarah Hooper got 6 months, her husband got 5 years. Female offenders were often cast as dupes or assistants rather than principal culprits, a narrative that helped reduce their sentences. Minnie Pheby notably did not attempt this tactic. She never implicated any man as leading her astray. Her unwavering acceptance of sole responsibility set her apart, and perhaps puzzled those who expected a male mastermind in every burglary. Criminological theories. Victorian criminology often viewed female offenders through a lens of biological and moral deviancy. The Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso wrote in La Donna Delinquent, The Female Offender, 1893, ENG trans. 1895, that criminal women were atavistic throwbacks, prone to deceit but generally lacking the physical prowess or intellect for violent or organized crime. He noted that shoplifting was especially feminine crime, given women's supposed penchant for petty theft and the opportunities presented by their roles as consumers and domestics. By Lombroso's logic, a female burglar like Pheby would be an anomaly explained only by an extremely aberrant nature. Essentially, he would class her as a highly degenerate woman. While modern historians critique these sexist theories, they were influential in Phebe's time and likely influenced how police and courts perceived her. Police attitudes. Within Scotland Yard, female criminals were largely dismissed as minor players. Decades later, Frederick Porter Wensley, a top London detective from the 1890s, 1920s, reflected in his memoir that women are seldom masterminds in crime. This statement, published in 1931, encapsulated the long-standing bias that women could not be the principal agents in serious crimes. Phebe's career directly challenged this assumption. Initially, even D.S. Not believed he was chasing a male gang in 1896. Only after catching Minnie did he, and his superiors, grudgingly realize a single young woman had outsmarted them. By 1900, Not knew very well what Pheby was capable of, but he still had to convince the magistrates of her sole responsibility for the 15-house crime spree. The judge's continued reluctance to believe in a one-woman crime wave is evident from Phebe's moderate sentence in 1900, and the judge's skepticism that a woman could carry out all those burglaries unassisted. In summary, Victorian London's social norms dictated that women were the guardians of the home, not its violators. Minnie Pheby's very existence as a prolific homebreaker unsettled these norms. She took her society's low expectations of women's criminality and turned them to her advantage, confounding the police, receiving light sentences, and gaining a degree of infamy that has persisted in historical accounts. Her story sits at the intersection of true crime and gender history, illustrating how Victorian fears and fascinations with crime were magnified when the criminal was a woman. Victorian women's prison life, hard labor at Wormwood Scrubs and beyond. Minnie Pheby served her multiple sentences under the regime of late Victorian prisons, which were harsh and regimented, but also reflected emerging ideas about rehabilitation, often infused with moralism. For female prisoners like Pheby, life in prison was characterized by strict discipline, strenuous work, religious instruction, and solitude. Wormwood Scrubs Prison, London. Phebe's confirmed sentences in 1896, 1897, and 1900 were all served at HM Prison Wormwood Scrubs in West London. Wormwood Scrubs was a relatively new prison, opened 1874, renowned for its size and modern design, with over 1,300 cells in a radial floor plan that allowed ample light and ventilation, a reform-minded feature at the time. It primarily housed male convicts, but also had facilities for women serving short sentences. Phebe's terms were classified as hard labor, meaning she was required to perform physically demanding work as part of her punishment. Victorian prison schedules were extremely strict. Days began early, often by 5:30 or 6 a.m., with the ringing of a bell. Prisoners were roused to clean their cells, which at the Scrubs were standard 10 by 13-foot chambers furnished with only a plank bed, a stool, a small table, and perhaps a Bible and tin cup. After roll call and prayers, prisoners labored in assigned work shifts, punctuated by meager meals of gruel or bread. Silence was strictly enforced. Communication between inmates was forbidden except during brief, supervised intervals. Punishments for infractions included solitary confinement on bread and water or the dreaded dark cell. For women, typical forms of prison labor included sewing, mending uniforms, laundry work, cleaning, and other traditionally feminine tasks. At Woking Female Convict Prison, which held longer-term female convicts, inmates made prison clothes, picked oakum, untwisting old ropes, a torturous menial job that bloodied the fingers, and even did outdoor tasks like farm work and pumping water, divided by ability. At Wormwood Scrubs, female prisoners likely engaged in sewing and laundry to support the prison's operations. A report from 1892 describes women at Woking busy at twine making and working in a laundry room, very industriously. We can reasonably assume Phoebe's daily routine involved similar toil, scrubbing floors, washing linens, sewing prison uniforms or sacks, for long hours. Hard labor was intended not only to punish but also to reform through disciplined work. However, the efficacy of this was dubious. The regimen was intentionally humbling. Inmates wore coarse uniforms, often with easily identifiable markings or in different colors to denote their prisoner class and progress. Their hair might be cut short. In Wormwood Scrubs, new prisoners spent the first months in separate confinement, each in their own cell, not allowed to mix, to encourage reflection and remorse. Religious instruction was provided by chaplains, who believed in guiding fallen women back to virtue through scripture and moral lessons. Conditions and challenges. Despite being modern, Victorian prisons were by today's standards very grim. Overcrowding was common, though Wormwood Scrubs was less crowded than older prisons. Heating was minimal. Illness, particularly chest infections, was rife in the damp, cold cells. Nutrition was poor. The prison diet was deliberately bland and scant. Prisoners like Phoebe, used to the smoggy but free streets of London, suddenly found themselves in a world reduced to a 13 by 10 cell and monotonous routine. Still, some observers claimed conditions at the Scrubs were relatively humane for the time. Major General Edmund Duquesne, Britain's chief prison administrator, argued in 1885 that the new prisons offered clean and well-ventilated accommodation, with every cell getting some sunlight daily. This was part of a Victorian penal philosophy that emphasized order and morality. The environment was punitive but not chaotic, designed to instill discipline. For female prisoners in particular, the system also aimed at enforced domesticity. There was an assumption that women once reformed should return to roles as servants, wives, or mothers. Thus, their prison training often centered on domestic skills, laundry, needlework, as these were thought to cultivate appropriate feminine virtues. A reporter visiting Woking in 1889 noted with a touch of irony that considerable thought was given to women convicts' dress and routines, as befits a ladies' establishment, highlighting how even in prison, women were expected to conform to certain standards of femininity and orderliness. Phoebe's likely experience. While we don't have Phoebe's personal account, we know she endured at least 4 separate stints in jail. The 1900 newspaper account mentions that she cares nothing for police, magistrate, or judge, and was ready to accept any punishment. Indeed, she had experience by then. One imagines that by her final imprisonment, Phoebe was a well-known character to the matrons and governors at the Scrubs. Her quick reoffending after earlier releases suggests that the hard labor and prison life did little to reform her. If anything, it might have further criminalized her by networking her with other prisoners or hardening her against authority. Victorian prisons did not offer any psychological treatment or job training beyond rudimentary skills, so upon release prisoners like Phoebe returned to society stigmatized and often no better prepared to earn an honest living than before. In short, Minnie Pheby's prison life would have been one of toil, tedium, and regimentation. Victorian penal philosophy sought to break the spirit of inmates and then remake them into docile citizens, but Phoebe emerged seemingly unbroken and unrepentant. Her ability to reoffend swiftly and her insolent courtroom demeanor in 1900, is that all? Suggests that the months of scrubbing floors and picking oakum did not extinguish her daring nature. Media and cultural representations of Minnie Pheby and her ilk. Victorian press coverage. Minnie Pheby's criminal career coincided with the height of the Victorian popular press, which eagerly sensationalized crime, especially crimes that upended social expectations. From the moment of her 1896 capture, Pheby was thrust into the spotlight as an object of both moral panic and dark fascination. Newspapers gave her dramatic monikers like the Lady Burglar, Female Jack Sheppard, after a famous 18th-century male burglar, or a female Sykes. Articles emphasized her youth, appearance, and gender. The media often portrayed Pheby with a mix of astonishment, repugnance, and a subtle undercurrent of admiration for her boldness. One article quipped that it was well that female burglars are a rarity, implying relief that not many women followed Phoebe's path, because those who did could be as formidable as any man. The press coverage fed public curiosity about how a woman could possess the traits of a master burglar. Phebe was described as determined, active, and possessing unwomanly physical prowess. This challenged the era's gender stereotypes, making her a subject of debate as well as titillation. Public fascination and myth-making, stories of female criminals like Phoebe played into broader Victorian themes. The notion of the angel in the house, the ideal virtuous woman devoted to home and family, was deeply ingrained. Phoebe was, as Lucy Worsley aptly put it in a modern analysis, not a homemaker, but a homebreaker. This flip of the script, a woman invading homes rather than tending to her own, had a transgressive thrill that sold papers. Some press reports implied Phoebe must have had a Fagin-like mentor or male accomplice, because a solitary woman thief was so beyond the pale. When none was found, she was sometimes likened to a wild creature. The New Zealand Herald called her this remarkable woman, and detailed her cunning as if describing a clever fox or cat. The nickname Catwoman of West London has been used in modern times, e.g. a 2025 documentary video by true crime enthusiasts, to brand Phoebe's story, drawing parallels to the fictional comic book anti-heroine. This shows how her legend has been revived in contemporary pop culture, albeit anachronistically. The DC Comics character Catwoman debuted in 1940, long after Phoebe's time. Literary and cultural legacy. In Phoebe's own era, there's no evidence she directly inspired Victorian novelists. She was active in the 1890s, just as A.J. Raffles, the gentleman thief created by E.W. Hornung, was gaining popularity. The first Raffles stories were published in 1898 to 1899. Raffles is a very different figure, an upper-class male burglar who steals for sport, but the contemporaneous fascination with Phoebe and other burglars was part of the cultural milieu that made Raffles popular. In the 20th century, Phoebe was largely forgotten in mainstream culture, overshadowed by male counterparts and fictional analogues. However, her story has seen a revival in academic circles and media. Myth versus reality. Culturally, Minnie Pheby occupies a space between myth and reality. Victorian England had long-standing legends of female criminals, Jenny Diver, a notorious 18th-century pickpocket, for example, or the female poisoner archetype, but the female cat burglar was new territory. The press made her into a larger-than-life figure, emphasizing her acrobatics and nerveless daring, to the point of portraying her almost as a fictional character. At the same time, by all accounts, the real Phoebe was indeed remarkable. She was strong, agile, and unabashed. As one modern commentator notes, the Victorians were both appalled and fascinated by women's physical capabilities and boldness when those qualities manifested in criminal ways. Phoebe's enduring intrigue in books and media today stems from that same Victorian fascination. She represents a true story that feels like Victorian crime fiction. The fate of Minnie Pheby after 1900. One of the biggest lingering questions about Minnie Pheby is what happened to her after her release from prison in 1901. Unfortunately, definitive answers remain elusive. Here is what the evidence, and its silences, suggest. End of documented record. Minnie Pheby's known timeline effectively stops after her third conviction in 1900 and the completion of her 18-month sentence, circa late 1901. No further Old Bailey trials or press mentions of her appear after that point. By 1901, she would have been around 25 years old, still young, but with a notorious reputation. The lack of later records could indicate a number of possibilities. Ceasing criminal activity. It's possible that after serving her longest sentence, Pheby chose to abandon her life of crime. Perhaps the cumulative toll of multiple imprisonments, or fear of even harsher punishment if she continued, finally deterred her. If she did go straight, she might have changed her name or kept a very low profile. Ex-prisoners often struggled to find honest work due to stigma, but some did manage to rebuild their lives quietly. Marriage or name change. If Pheby married after 1901, any subsequent records, census entries, death registration, etc., would likely be under her married name, making her harder to trace. Marriage was a common outcome for women who exited the penal system. A husband could provide financial support and a new identity. A marriage would effectively erase Minnie Pheby from the public record. A cursory search of marriage registers for Minnie or Mary Pheby in the 1900s did not immediately yield a confirmed match, but many records from that era are not easily searchable online without more detailed information. Further crime under alias or outside London. It's also possible that Pheby resumed criminal activity in a different locale or under a different name, which would mean her exploits wouldn't be obviously connected to the Minnie Pheby of Shepherd's Bush. Some criminals of the period did attempt fresh starts, geographically or with new identities. Illness or death. Life expectancy for ex-prisoners, especially those who had spent formative years in hard labor, was not high. If Pheby fell ill or died relatively young, say in her 30s, her death might have gone unremarked except in routine records. For instance, if she died under a married name, we would not recognize it as her. We do know from the 1900 article that by age 24 she was described as well-built and active, implying good health and strength at least in her crime years. Context: notorious versus forgotten. It's worth noting that criminals who did not reoffend often faded into obscurity, while those who continued, or who committed more notorious crimes like murder, stayed in the public eye. Pheby may have benefited from the anonymity that came with being a woman in late Victorian society. Once she was out of the headlines, people soon moved on to other stories. Unlike, say, Jack the Ripper, never caught, or even male burglars like Charles Peace, who was executed in 1879 and became a folk anti-hero, Phebe's notoriety was short-lived. Only recently have scholars and writers rediscovered her story as a curious footnote in the history of crime and women's emancipation. Unless new archival discoveries come to light, for example, a marriage certificate or a later police record under an alias that can be definitively linked to her, Minnie Pheby's post-1901 life remains a mystery. In the absence of evidence, her story ends as she steps out of prison gates for the last time, leaving us to wonder if she attempted to live a lawful life or if she continued to steal in the shadows, undetected. Bibliography. Binney, John, and Henry Mayhew. The Criminal Prisons of London and Scenes of Prison Life. London, Griffin, Bone and Company, 1862. Digital Panopticon. Minnie Pheby, born in 1876, Life Archive ID OBDEF 1-164-189700208. The Digital Panopticon, Tracing London Convicts in Britain and Australia, 1780 to 1925. https://www.digitalpanopticon.org/life?ID=OBPDEF 1-164-189700208. Holsworth, Larry. Meet the Lady Gangsters and Criminals of the Victorian Age. History Collection, June 30, 2021. https://historycollection.com/meet-the-lady-gangsters-of-the-Victorian-age. Moss, Eloise. To Catch a Lady Burglar. History Today 69, No. 7, July 2019 10-12. https://www.historytoday.com/archive/miscellaneous/catch-lady-burglar. Night Raiders, Burglary and the Making of Modern Urban Life in London, 1860 to 1968. Oxford, Oxford University Press, 2019. Old Bailey Proceedings. Minnie Pheby, Theft, Burglary, February 24, 1896. Case T189602224-274. Old Bailey Proceedings Online. https://www.oldbaileyonline.org/browse, JSP?ID =T189602224-274. Minnie Pheby, Theft, Burglary, February 8, 1897. Case T189702081-164. Old Bailey Proceedings Online. https://www.oldbaileyonline.org/browse, JSP?ID =T189702081-164. Papers Past. A Female Sykes, The Ways of a Woman Housebreaker. New Zealand Herald, May 19, 1900, Supplement, 2. https://paperspast, natlib government, nz/newspapers/NZH19000519260019. Worsley, Lucy. Minnie Pheby, Lady Burglar. Episode 46. Lady Killers with Lucy Worsley. BBC Radio 4, June 24, 2025. Podcast. https://www.bbc.co.uk/programs/m001nxyz. The British Newspaper Archive Blog. Endurance File, Exploring life behind prison bars over a century ago. April 15, 2021. https://blog.britishnewspaperarchive uk/2021/04/15/ exploring-life-behind-prison-bars/ Wensley, Frederick Porter. 40 Years of Scotland Yard, a record of lifetime service in the Criminal Investigation Department. London, Castle and Company, 1931.